The laughter didn't start quietly, it exploded. It spread across the internet like wildfire, vicious, uncontrollable, merciless. Because the moment Meghan Markle whispered to her inner circle that she was launching her own fashion brand, the reaction wasn't applause, it was mockery. Brutal, relentless mockery. People weren't just questioning her comeback, they were clowning her, publicly, loudly. And behind the scenes, insiders say she could feel every single stab. Because this wasn't just a business move. This was survival. This was desperation wrapped in couture. This was Meghan Markle trying to reclaim control of a narrative that had been slipping out of her hands for months, maybe even years. According to people who had been sitting in rooms with her, listening to her pitch this new vision with a carefully measured voice and burning intensity behind her eyes, she truly believed this fashion brand would be her resurrection. Not just a clothing line, a statement, a declaration that she wasn't finished, that she couldn't be erased, that she was still powerful, still relevant, still untouchable. Internet clowns Meghan as she is, but outside those private rooms, reality was colder. Because while Meghan was dreaming of a triumphant comeback, the fashion world wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. In fact, behind those glossy showroom doors and velvet curtains, her name was no longer being whispered with admiration, it was being spoken with hesitation, with caution, with warning. And it didn't help that the timing looked suspiciously convenient, because this sudden fashion empire announcement came right as multiple deals around her had quietly collapsed. Partnerships that once looked promising had vanished into silence. Phone calls that used to be returned immediately were now being ignored. Invitations that once flooded her inbox had slowed to a trickle. And worst of all, brands that once fought for her attention were now distancing themselves deliberately. Some insiders claim she knew it was happening. They claim she could feel the shift, the invisible wall rising around her. But Meghan wasn't someone who retreated. She recalculated, she pivoted, she reinvented. And this fashion brand, this was her counterattack. Behind closed doors, she reportedly framed it as more than clothing. She described it as culture, as identity, as influence reborn. She told potential investors this wasn't just about style, it was about power, about shaping conversations, about controlling perception. But even those listening closely couldn't ignore the tension hanging in the air, because there was one haunting question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Why now? Why launch something this massive when so many other ventures had stalled? Why step into an industry that was already quietly shutting its doors on her? The answer, some believed, was simple. She had no other choice, because Meghan had built her post-royal life on momentum, attention, visibility, relevance. And when those things started slipping, everything else started slipping with them. This brand wasn't just a project, it was her lifeline. But while Meghan was building her comeback in private, the internet was building something else entirely. Doubt, and not the quiet kind. Explosive doubt. Because critics weren't just questioning the brand's quality, they were questioning its authenticity. They were questioning its purpose. They were questioning whether this was truly a creative venture or simply another attempt to stay in the spotlight. Some voices online were cruel. Others were clinical. But they all shared one dangerous sentiment. They weren't convinced. And that uncertainty was spreading faster than any marketing campaign ever could. Meanwhile, whispers inside elite fashion circles painted an even darker picture. Designers who once tolerated her presence were now hesitant to attach their names to hers. Executives who once saw opportunity now saw risk. Collaborators who once chased proximity now stepped back cautiously, unwilling to be pulled into unpredictable storms. Because Meghan didn't just bring attention, she brought headlines. And headlines meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant exposure. Exposure meant danger. And the fashion world, for all its glamour, survives on control, on precision, on carefully crafted illusion. Chaos was never welcome, yet chaos had begun following Meghan everywhere, and she knew it. People close to her described a woman who was fiercely determined but deeply aware of the stakes. A woman who understood that this brand wasn't just about fabric and stitching, it was about rewriting history, about reshaping how the world saw her before that image became permanently frozen. Because perception, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim, and Meghan had lost more of it than she was willing to admit. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire saga wasn't Meghan herself, it was Harry. Because while Meghan was charging forward, Harry was growing quieter, more distant, more withdrawn. People who had once seen him fiercely protective now noticed something different, something subtle, something uncomfortable. Silence. He wasn't defending her as loudly anymore. He wasn't standing at the center of the storm. He was drifting to the edges, watching, observing, processing. And that shift didn't go unnoticed because for years, Harry had been her shield, her defender, her loudest ally. But now insiders whispered he was tired, not physically, emotionally, mentally, existentially. The life he had chosen, the rebellion, the escape, the promise of freedom hadn't unfolded the way he imagined. The glamour had faded. The applause had softened. The doors that once opened effortlessly now required negotiation. And sometimes they didn't open at all, which made Meghan's fashion brand even more critical because it wasn't just her comeback, it was their survival story, their final reinvention, their last chance to prove that leaving everything behind hadn't been a mistake. But the world wasn't waiting patiently. The world was watching carefully, analyzing every move, every announcement, every whisper. And the more Meghan pushed forward, the louder the question became. Was this the rise of a new empire or the last act of a collapsing illusion? Because behind the confidence, behind the polished words and bold promises, behind the carefully curated image of a woman reclaiming her destiny, there were cracks. Small, invisible, but growing. And those cracks were about to widen in ways nobody expected. The cracks didn't explode overnight. They crept in slowly, silently, like a truth Meghan couldn't outrun no matter how fast she tried to reinvent herself. Because while she was presenting this fashion brand as her bold new empire, insiders say the private reality was far more fragile. Investors weren't lining up the way her team had hoped. Meetings that were supposed to end with handshakes ended with polite smiles and vague promises. People listened, they nodded, they complimented the vision. But when it came time to commit, they hesitated. And hesitation was the most dangerous signal of all. Because hesitation meant doubt, and doubt meant fear. Fear that attaching themselves to Meghan wasn't an opportunity anymore, it was a liability. The shift was undeniable. Only a few years earlier, Meghan Markle's name alone carried gravity. She could move markets with a single appearance. She could spark international headlines without saying a word. She was unpredictable, controversial, but undeniably powerful. Brands didn't just want her, they needed her. But now the power dynamic had reversed. Now she needed them. And they knew it. That imbalance changed everything. Sources say Meghan's pitches became more intense, more urgent. She spoke about legacy, about cultural influence, about building something that would outlive criticism. She framed the brand as a revolution, a platform that wasn't just selling clothes, but selling meaning. But some people in those rooms couldn't ignore the uncomfortable pattern. They had heard grand visions before. They had seen ambitious rollouts before. They had watched promises dissolve into silence before. And nobody wanted to be the next casualty of a narrative that no longer guaranteed success. Behind the scenes, her team worked overtime trying to maintain the illusion of momentum. Carefully worded leaks were planted. Strategic whispers were released. The idea was simple. If the world believed the brand was inevitable, then inevitability might become reality. But belief couldn't be manufactured forever because the internet had become ruthless. Every announcement was dissected. Every detail questioned, every inconsistency amplified. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting for proof, waiting for validation, waiting for failure. And Meghan could feel it. She had always been hyper-aware of perception, but now perception had turned into pressure. The stakes weren't just professional, they were personal. Because this brand wasn't only about reclaiming her public image, it was about proving she hadn't miscalculated everything. Because the whispers surrounding her personal life were growing louder too. Harry, once inseparable from her public identity, was becoming harder to place. He appeared less frequently beside her. His energy had shifted. His posture had changed. Observers described him as quieter, more introspective, less certain. Not broken, but different. People who had watched him closely said he seemed caught between two worlds, the one he left behind and the one he had built, and neither felt entirely stable anymore. He had gambled everything on this new life. His family, his role, his identity. And now, with doors quietly closing and opportunities narrowing, the weight of that gamble was impossible to ignore. Friends claimed he had moments of visible regret, not dramatic breakdowns, not explosive confrontations, just quiet realizations, the kind that settle slowly into your bones, the kind that make you stare into nothing and wonder where the road forked. Because Hollywood wasn't the fairy tale he had imagined. It was transactional, conditional, cold. Loyalty lasted only as long as relevance did, and relevance was slipping. Meanwhile, Meghan refused to retreat. If anything, anything, the resistance made her more determined. She doubled down on the fashion brand. She pushed harder. She refined the messaging. She insisted this wasn't desperation, it was evolution. She told people this brand represented independence, control, freedom, but critics saw something else. They saw urgency disguised as empowerment. They saw survival disguised as confidence. They saw someone racing against time, because time was the one enemy nobody could negotiate with. Public perception doesn't collapse in a single moment. It erodes gradually, quietly, until one day the foundation that once felt unshakable simply isn't there anymore. And Meghan's foundation had been built on attention. But attention is fickle. It moves on, it forgets, it replaces. The world that once revolved around her had found new distractions, new scandals, new icons, new stories. And Meghan was no longer the center. She was fighting to become it again. The fashion brand was her weapon, her last, most calculated move to reclaim narrative dominance. But the most brutal truth was this: even if the brand launched, even if the designs were flawless, even if the rollout was perfect, none of it guaranteed redemption. Because redemption isn't decided by effort, it's decided by belief. And belief was no longer guaranteed. Some insiders feared she knew that. They said there were moments when her confidence flickered just briefly before she masked it again with determination. Moments when she understood how much was riding on this single move. Because failure now wouldn't just be a setback, it would be confirmation. Confirmation of every whisper, every criticism, every doubt. And that was something she couldn't afford, because Meghan Markle had built her entire identity on reinvention. She had transformed herself repeatedly, from actress to royal to global activist to media power player. But reinvention only works when the world accepts the new version. And acceptance was no longer automatic, which meant this fashion brand wasn't just another chapter. It was a verdict, a final test, a moment that would decide whether she still had the power to shape her own destiny or whether destiny had already moved on without her. And as she stood on the edge of this uncertain future, surrounded by cautious allies, skeptical observers, and a husband quietly wrestling with his own reality, one terrifying possibility loomed larger than any headline. What if the world wasn't laughing because they didn't understand her vision? What if they were laughing because they already knew the ending?